More than 24 Harvard University student organizations declared in a statement on Saturday that the Israeli regime was, quote, entirely responsible for the violence in its fight against Gaza. This is according to Fox News. A joint statement from Harvard-Palestine solidarity groups reads, "We, the undersigned student organizations, hold the Israeli regime entirely responsible for all unfolding violence. Today's events did not occur in a vacuum. For the last 2 decades, millions of Palestinians in Gaza have been forced to live in an open-air prison." Now, student groups at Columbia and Swarthmore universities are also facing backlash for similar statements that they made condemning Israel. Also facing backlash are Representatives Rashida Tlaib and Cori Bush. Representative Tlaib posted on Instagram, quote, "I grieve the Palestinian and Israeli lives lost yesterday, today, and every day. I am determined as ever to fight for a just future where everyone can live in peace, without fear, and with true freedom, equal rights, and human dignity. The path to that future must include lifting the blockade, ending the occupation, and dismantling the apartheid system that creates the suffocating, dehumanizing conditions that can lead to resistance." Representative Bush also wrote on Saturday, quote, "I am heartbroken by the ongoing violence in Palestine and Israel as part of achieving a just and lasting peace. We must do our part to stop the violence and trauma by ending U.S. government support for Israeli military occupation and apartheid."
Journalist Jackson Frank, who recently became a Sixers writer for the Philly Voice, was reportedly let go following a tweet showing solidarity with Palestine in response to the team's remarks about Israel. The team wrote in a statement, "We stand with the people of Israel and join them in mourning the hundreds of innocent lives lost to terrorism at the hands of Hamas." In response, Frank wrote, "This post sucks. Solidarity with Palestine always." Philly Voice CEO Hal Donnelly told the New York Post Mr. Frank is no longer employed by phillyvoice.com as of today. Frank denied the New York Post's request for comment. More in censorship news. Playboy has also fired former porn star Mia Khalifa after she expressed support for Hamas following its attack on Israel. She wrote on X, "Can someone please tell the freedom fighters in Palestine to flip their phones and film horizontal?" In another now deleted tweet, she called a photo of Hamas fighters a resistance painting.
A Renaissance painting.
A Renaissance painting.
Yeah, look, I think a lot of these statements, not all of them, but a lot of them are pretty bad.
Let's start with the Harvard one. What's your objection?
Well, I don't think it's true that Israel or the Israeli government is entirely bears all and sole blame for what happened. I mean, individual people have some agency here. A militant group attacked a music festival, took innocent people hostage, are holding them hostage still, indiscriminately fired at, killed, again, civilians, women, children, older people. Let's not in our understandable need to discuss the broader causes of the conflict, for which I certainly do think there is blame to go around, totally whitewashing all responsibility of the people actually engaged in the violence, which I do not believe is justifiable. What they did at all is bad, and that's what the students at Harvard did, and Columbia, and a couple other places.
It's interesting.
Similarly, and then just
wait a minute. Let's stay with Harvard for a second. I have a response to that. Interestingly, that their Harvard statement is almost identical to a statement from Israel's leading newspaper's editorial board, Haaretz, which was published, I believe, on the 8th, so over the weekend. That statement said, "The disaster that befell Israel on the holiday of Simchat Torah is the clear responsibility of one person, Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister who has prided himself on his vast political experience and irreplaceable wisdom in security matters, completely failed to identify the dangers he was consciously leading Israel into when establishing a government of annexation and dispossession, when appointing Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir to key positions, while embracing a foreign policy that openly ignored the existence and rights of Palestinians." So both of these statements are putting the Israeli paper says Benjamin Netanyahu, the Harvard groups say the Israeli regime, but both squarely put total blame, no caveats. Now, I probably would have thrown a caveat word in there, almost all, something like that. But both of these two groups, including this major Israeli paper, put the square responsibility on the Israeli government or government actor Benjamin Netanyahu for both failing to anticipate this and for creating the conditions of 2 million people living in an open-air prison for years and creating the conditions for a resistance, which, by the way, it is noted, occupied people have the right to resist under international law. That is a true statement of international law.
Do occupied people have the right to take hostages?
No.
Right. So again, the actions of the actual violent terrorist people involved are illegitimate, regardless of the broader
the rights
political
language
context.
is difficult. It's the targeting civilians and killing civilians and taking civilian hostages that is the war crime.
Yes.
But the statements that are being made.
End of sentence. Period. It's just a war crime, what they've done, and they bear responsibility for that.
Well, it's not end of sentence, period. There are a lot of other sentences that people feel the need to articulate, including calling out the conditions of occupation and apartheid that have led groups like Hamas to become, frankly, the only political outlet for the occupied peoples in those territories.
Right.
And partly, as we discussed in another segment, because of the choices of the Israeli government to suppress and deflate the power of secular, non-radical groups in favor of a group like Hamas.
For sure. And we should talk about that, and we should analyze that, and those sentences should appear alongside sentences, given what just happened, condemning the actual actions of the terrorist group. Just like when we talk about Ukraine and Russia, we analyze the bad foreign policy decisions that the U.S. government has made, from the 90s vis-a-vis NATO and vis-a-vis the antagonizing of Russia, mistakes the Ukrainian government has made in the run-up to the conflict, and ongoing bad policies they're doing. Again, we should talk about that because we need to be clear-minded about foreign policy, but I would never say the Russia-Ukraine war is entirely the fault of Ukraine or of the U.S. Again, Russia made a very bad and humanitarian catastrophic decision to invade the country. So I think nuance is required, and the statements from the students and then from Mia Khalifa, who's a former pornographic actress, I mean, her tweets were coming very close to just kind of glorifying the violence that Hamas is engaged in.
It's interesting that you say, as long as you say, of course, killing civilians is bad, there's nothing wrong with talking about occupation, but that's exactly what Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar did.
I'm not criticizing
so let's move on to those statements. My point about the Haaretz newspaper editorial board is that the controversy that is being heaped on Harvard, Larry Summers, former president of Harvard University, tweeted something to the effect of, I have never been more ashamed to be associated with the Harvard community, or nothing in my career has ever brought me as much shame. And people, I think, appropriately responded with photos of him cavorting with Jeffrey Epstein. At the end of my Harvard career, he had to step down because he told all women science majors, of which I was one, that we weren't good at STEM. That's
an exaggeration of what he said.
I can think of a lot of instances which were pretty shameful in his career. But it's very interesting that the level of public rebuke, calls for censorship, and the like that were heaped upon these 12, 14, Harvard groups, student groups, for saying exactly what is a relatively mainstream opinion in the editorial pages of Israel's leading newspaper. Now, turning to what has the pushback against the Congress members, they did exactly all of the caveating language that anybody would want, and I think which is appropriate. 4 or 5 paragraphs of statement, only concluding at the end in Cori Bush's statement with a call to ending the occupation of Palestine, and yet she's still called out and being pushed back and called to step down on all of these things by people across the political spectrum in Congress and beyond. And Rashida Tlaib was dragged all over the internet for being a Palestinian American woman with a Palestinian flag outside of her office, for having that flag as though she's supposed to renounce her cultural identity as a consequence of a terrorist act in another country, on the other side of the world.
Yeah, I didn't have as much problem with those statements. Again, I think, and
did you have any problem with those
mostly
statements?
I want our members of Congress to affirm that we should not send more military aid to either side of this conflict, or to Ukraine, or to anyone else. That's the relevant. Their personal opinions on the conflict don't really matter to me. They're the people who actually get to allocate where our funding goes. And I would like them to affirm that we're not going to draw the U.S. into a broader conflict. As far as the students, obviously they have the right. They absolutely should have the free speech right to engage in political advocacy, or to say things I think are bad or wrong or offensive, and they should not suffer consequences for that. I'm sure some people on the internet were saying, they expel them or something. I didn't specifically see any of those, but I'm sure they're out there. I don't agree with any of that. Obviously, I think universities in general should just not make the university comms department just should not make statements on behalf
Well, that
of the
wasn't the
organization.
university.
Well, no.
Comms
What I'm
department.
saying is there's a lot of calls right now for the university to denounce those students, because in the past universities do put out political statements saying, well, we don't agree with this speech, but nevertheless we're affirming like their right to say it. Although, of course, universities violate students' free speech rights all the time. They should just not even do that part in like all circumstances. They can just reaffirm the students' free speech rights. So obviously, I don't think anything bad should happen to the students, but that people are allowed to mock their bad opinions if they want, including Larry Summers.
Sure, he can, and he can get Epstein posted under every single one of his posts for the next couple of days as a consequence of doing so.
Now, Mia Khalifa is not a. I mean, you described it as a censorship. We can use the word censorship in a kind of broader context. She doesn't have the same kind of speech protections that that you do from the government, or even that the students do at various universities, given like the actual contract of being a student there, right, includes some free speech language. As just the employee of a company, you can be fired for having a bad political opinion. Now, whether that's good or not is a different
Well, you certainly
argument.
can, and I'm very interested. Apparently, this 76ers reporter is very popular in the sports reporting space. He said that the statement issued by the 76ers sucked, probably for the same reason that many people who support the rights of Palestinians think these statements suck, not because it condemns the violence against innocent Israelis, but because it ignores the violence against innocent Palestinians and the occupation that is a precursor to all of this. So he apparently does not have the right as a media figure to say on Twitter, on his personal account, I don't like this statement. I stand with Palestine. That is it's the situation we're living in. I don't know anybody who's been fired for saying I stand with Israel. And I think that speaks volumes about the state of discourse around this particular issue in this country and what kind of the establishment allowance is for expressing sympathies for people in the middle of a terrible situation.
I mean, there are also a lot of cases of. Did you see like the statement of Gretchen Whitmer, governor of Michigan? Her statement about about what had happened was like so vague you couldn't even be sure she was talking about the conflict that's because she was afraid to upset lefty people.
Well, she should be. I'm sorry. That's your constituency. Michigan has a large Arab population who have been upset for years about the conditions, the apartheid conditions of 2 million people who are living in Gaza. Like, this is the reality.
I mean, if you're afraid to say the killing of the targeted killing and hostage taking of innocent civilians,
she shouldn't be afraid to say that. Cori Bush said that in her statement. The part they're afraid to say is, I stand against the occupation of Gaza. That's the part they're all afraid to say because they know that's contrary to American foreign policy.
I don't think that's what Gretchen Whitmer was afraid to say, but we will continue covering this, including some more statements from some more folks in just a minute. More Rising. Stay tuned.